April 1943, Farmingdale, Long Island. The night shift hums inside the Republic Aviation Plant. Sparks dance from welding torches, echoing against high steel rafters. A young engineer wipes sweat from his brow as a foreman yells over the din. In the corner, under a tarp, rests a fighter so massive, so unlike anything before it, that pilots call it a flying mistake. But across the ocean, in a cold German hangar, Luftwaffe mechanics work under dim yellow bulbs, sharpening the fangs of the Messerschmitts that still rule the sky. Neither side knows it yet, but the balance of air power is about to shift forever. This is the birth of the Thunderbolt. The spring of 1943 carried a strange stillness. Europe lay beneath a blanket of smoke and exhaustion. The Luftwaffe, once the proud hammer of Hitler's blitzkrieg, now strained under the endless pressure of Allied bombers crossing the Channel. But they still dominated the skies. In England, the 8th Air Force was bleeding men at an unbearable rate. Flying fortresses, the B-17s, took off in shining formations, but too often returned with half their numbers gone. The escort fighters they had, the P-38s and early P-39s, couldn't reach far enough into Germany. Every mission was a gamble against range and death. And so, American engineers were ordered to build something new, something that could protect the bombers all the way to the heart of the Reich. At the Republic Aviation Corporation on Long Island, they worked without sleep. Their creation looked nothing like a graceful warbird. It was thick, heavy, and unapologetically American, a brute forged from necessity, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. To the untrained eye, it was an insult to aerodynamics. To the men who built it, it was a fortress that could fly. Inside its nose roared the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, one of the most powerful piston engines ever made. 18 cylinders, 2-stage supercharged, wrapped in armor so thick it could shrug off machine gun fire. This was not a duelist's aircraft. It was a survivor's machine. At first, even American pilots laughed. They called it a barrel, a bathtub, a beast. They wanted speed and agility, not a 10,000-pound thundercloud. But when they throttled up that Double Wasp and felt the raw vibration shake the cockpit, they stopped laughing. Meanwhile, across the Channel at a Luftwaffe air base near Reims, German pilots trained under gray skies. They were veterans, survivors of the Battle of Britain and the Eastern Front. They trusted their Messerschmitt, Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, machines born from precision and fear. They believed they understood every opponent the Allies could send. Then the first reports came in, scattered, confused. American fighter was unusually large, very fast in dive, heavily armed, difficult to bring down. Laughter followed those reports. No one believed the Americans could build a fighter that could match German craftsmanship. But deep down, some Luftwaffe aces remembered 1940, when they had once mocked the British Spitfire until it began cutting them from the sky. And so a sliver of unease crept in. The Americans didn't just build planes, they built numbers. By 1943, the United States had become the greatest factory in history. While Europe burned, Detroit and Long Island sang with the rhythm of production. The heartbeat of democracy made mechanical. Every hour, new Thunderbolts rolled off the line. By the time one was test flown, another was already being painted with the star and bar insignia. Each rivet, each bolt, each gallon of aviation fuel was a promise that America would not just fight, it would outlast. Still, the men on the ground didn't know what awaited them. At Duxford and Debden airfields in England, young pilots studied their new machines. They were farm boys, factory workers, sons of miners, men who had never seen Europe before, now staring across it from cockpits of steel. The instructors warned them, this isn't a dance, it's endurance. The P-47 won't turn with a Messerschmitt, but it'll bring you home when others can't. They learned its rhythm, how it climbed reluctantly but dove like a stone, how its 8 Brownings spat fire that could cut a locomotive in half. They practiced gunnery until their shoulders bruised. They memorized the sound of that roaring engine, the sound that would soon fill the skies over Normandy and beyond. And still, silence hung over Europe. In occupied France, Luftwaffe mechanics prepared for another summer campaign. They didn't know the Americans were almost ready. They didn't know that in a matter of weeks, the flying barrel they mocked would begin erasing their transport lines, fuel depots, and airfields. They only knew that their own skies, for so long a domain of mastery, were beginning to feel smaller. The Allies were coming, and the thunder was rising. In the calm before battle, the air always feels heavier. Engines rumble on distant runways. Hands tighten on throttle grips. And somewhere, in that quiet heartbeat between invention and destruction, history takes its breath. The world had not yet seen what the P-47 could do, but when it did, when those wings of armor cut through cloud and smoke, even the Luftwaffe would whisper a single word in awe and dread. Donnerbolzen, the Thunderbolt. And the silence would never return. August 17, 1943, the air above Schweinfurt, Germany. Hundreds of B-17s crawl across the clouds, silver specks over a world at war. Their engines roar. Flak bursts bloom black around them. And far behind the formation, streaking down from the sun, a single P-47 dives, guns blazing. For the first time, German pilots look up at an American escort that doesn't break away. It fights back. The era of the Thunderbolt has begun. By late summer of 1943, the air war over Europe had reached its breaking point. The Allies were losing men faster than factories could train replacements. Every bombing mission into Germany was a roll of the dice, a gamble against altitude, weather, and the waiting teeth of the Luftwaffe. At the center of this storm were the B-17 flying fortresses, majestic, stubborn machines flying in tight formations toward the factories of Schweinfurt and Regensburg. Their target, the beating heart of Germany's ball-bearing industry, a lifeline for every tank, plane, and truck on the eastern and western fronts. The problem was, the fortresses were flying blind into a sky full of predators. Without long-range escorts, once they crossed the Rhine, they were alone. The German radar operators would track them, and soon the sirens wailed across occupied France and Belgium. Dozens of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs lifted from their runways, engines screaming, eager for the kill. But this time, something new was waiting. The Republic P-47s of the 4th and 56th Fighter Groups had finally arrived in numbers. Their task? To meet the Luftwaffe head-on. They were not fast to climb, but once at altitude, they became unstoppable. With their turbo superchargers roaring, the Thunderbolts could dive from 30,000 feet at speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, a velocity that left even veteran German aces stunned. Achtung, neue amerikanische Maschine. Sie taucht zu schnell, ich kann sie nicht treffen. Attention, new American machine. It dives too fast, well, I can't hit it. That was the first whisper of respect. In one of the earliest large-scale combats over France, a formation of P-47s under Colonel Hubert Zemke intercepted German fighters preparing to strike the bombers. Zemke's men had been ordered to hold their position, to escort and not pursue. But the Luftwaffe came hard, swarming from above in disciplined packs. When the first 109s made their attack run, Zemke broke formation. He shoved the throttle forward. The Thunderbolt roared, diving like a meteor. 8 50 caliber guns opened fire. In a single pass, 3 enemy planes fell, blazing from the sky. When the Thunderbolts climbed back toward the bombers, the American crews cheered through their oxygen masks. They had seen it with their own eyes. This heavy, awkward brute could fight. At Luftwaffe headquarters in Paris, the reports were unsettling. The Americans had introduced a new escort with armor thick as a bomber's, firepower to match, and a diving speed no German aircraft could chase. Its pilots were aggressive, unshaken by flak or tracer fire. It wasn't elegant. It was effective. And worse, there were more of them every week. American perspective, hopeful but weary. For the pilots flying the Thunderbolt, the first victories carried both pride and disbelief. They began to trust the machine. When a 20-millimeter shell hit the fuselage, it clanged but didn't tear through. When oil pressure dropped, the engine kept running long enough to limp home. Stories spread quickly across airfields of pilots landing with holes the size of fists, of wings peppered with shrapnel, yet still flying. The P-47 was earning a new name among its own, the Jug, short for Juggernaut. But victory had a price. On August 17th, the twin raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg marked one of the bloodiest days in the air war. 60 bombers were lost, hundreds of men killed or captured. Even with Thunderbolts guarding the first leg of the mission, the range limitation meant they had to turn back. The bombers still faced the long, lonely flight home, and the Luftwaffe waited. Pilots returning to base found the sky littered with smoke trails and parachutes. Radio silence filled the airwaves. Commanders at Debden and Boxted stood by the runways, counting the gaps in formation. For every tale of the P-47's strength, there was another of loss. Young faces that never returned from the horizon. And yet, amid the grief, something shifted. Strategists began to see that air superiority was not just about speed or agility, it was about endurance. The Thunderbolt could absorb punishment, fight its way home, and strike again tomorrow. It wasn't the weapon of a duel. It was the hammer of attrition. The Luftwaffe, built on precision and pride, had met an enemy built on resilience. In Berlin, Major Gunther Rahl, one of Germany's leading aces, wrote in his logbook, "Amerikanische Maschinen, schwer, stark, fast unzerstörbar. Ihre Piloten kommen immer wieder." American machines, heavy, strong, almost indestructible. Their pilots keep coming back. It was not admiration, it was recognition. By the end of 1943, the Thunderbolt had flown thousands of sorties. What began as a curiosity had become a symbol of persistence, an iron testament to America's belief that victory could be engineered. And across the ruins of occupied Europe, people began to hear a new sound in the distance, a deep rolling thunder that meant liberation was coming closer. War had reached its breaking point, and from here on, every engine roar would carry the echo of those who refused to yield. Because in war, power alone doesn't turn the tide. Endurance does. February 1944, northern France. The ground trembles beneath a line of German trucks. Engines grind. Mud sprays. The convoy stretches for miles. Suddenly, a sound. A deep rolling thunder builds above the clouds. 8 guns roar in unison. The earth erupts in flame and smoke. The Germans look up and see the round belly of a P-47 diving straight toward them. By early 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had found its true purpose. It was no longer just an escort fighter. It was a weapon of destruction, a machine designed to burn supply lines, fracture communication, and tear the skeleton from the German war machine. The men who flew it called themselves Jabos, fighter bombers. To them, altitude no longer mattered. Their war lived between the clouds and the treetops. Each mission began in darkness, pilots strapped in while the airfields of southern England still glowed with frost. They'd hear the rumble of the Pratt & Whitney engine come alive, the familiar growl that meant both power and peril. In those seconds before takeoff, men whispered quiet promises to their mothers, their wives, their God. Then the throttle slid forward, and the earth fell away. In preparation for Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of France, the Thunderbolt was assigned a new doctrine, interdiction warfare. Its mission: cripple the Reich's infrastructure before the boots ever touched Normandy's beaches. Day after day, P-47 squadrons scoured the French countryside. They attacked railway hubs, bridges, locomotives, fuel convoys, anything that could move or burn. At treetop height, they became reapers of metal and flame. Their wings carried bombs and rockets, 2 500-pounders beneath the fuselage, sometimes more under the wings. A single pass could turn a German transport column into a string of burning wreckage stretching across a valley. In the fields below, German troops learned to fear the sound. It started as a distant hum, a vibration that crawled across the earth. Then came the shriek of diving engines, the flash of tracers, the rain of steel. Donner, donner, thunder! They would yell and dive for ditches, hands over their helmets, praying the storm passed them by. No shelter was safe. Even the woods, once a refuge, became death traps when the jugs descended. German anti-aircraft gunners fought back with desperation. Flak batteries fired until their barrels glowed red. Sometimes they hit, sometimes they didn't. But even when a Thunderbolt fell, 2 more came behind it, relentless, merciless, mechanical. For the first time since 1940, German soldiers felt what their enemies had felt, the helplessness of being hunted from the sky. For the pilots, it was a brutal job. They flew through smoke, debris, and small arms fire, often returning home with bullet holes stitched through their wings. Some landed with half their controls gone. Others never came back at all. Captain Walker Bud Mahurin once wrote in his logbook, "When you dive that low, you can see their faces. You can see them running, and you pray your bombs hit steel, not men. But war doesn't let you choose." The Thunderbolt had become a symbol of dominance and burden. The P-47's massive radial engine and rugged frame made it perfect for the task. Unlike the liquid-cooled Mustangs, it could take hits and keep running. Its turbo supercharger allowed it to dive fast and climb out of danger. Pilots trusted it because it forgave their mistakes, even under fire. It was the aircraft that carried them through the inferno and brought them home. At Luftwaffe bases across France, morale faltered. Fuel was scarce. Maintenance crews stripped wrecks for parts. Even veteran pilots began to feel the weight of exhaustion. They could still outturn the Thunderbolt, but what did that matter when there were 10 more rising behind it? Every encounter bled their strength further, and the skies, once blue with confidence, grew darker with smoke. By March 1944, the Allies had near total tactical control over Western Europe. Bridges fell. Rail lines vanished. German logistics officers described the countryside as a labyrinth of craters and ghosts. The Thunderbolt wasn't elegant, it was efficient. And efficiency in war is the most terrifying weapon of all. But beneath the statistics, 86,000 targets destroyed in just 10 months, lay something deeper. The pilots weren't machines. They saw what they left behind. They smelled the burning oil, the shattered steel, the fields turned black with smoke. They carried those images home. Every flight left a mark, not just on the enemy, but on the men themselves. When the propellers stopped spinning and silence returned, They sat in their cockpits, staring at the horizon, knowing they had helped shape history and scarred it at the same time. In that silence, war felt less like victory and more like survival. Fire and blood, that was the language of 1944. June 6, 1944, dawn. A gray mist lies over the English Channel. Hundreds of ships crawl across the waves, forming the greatest armada the world has ever seen. Above them, like guardians of the storm, fly the thunderbolts. Their wings glint with dew and gunmetal. Their engines rumble in the distance, a sound not of one plane, but of many hearts beating together. This was it, D-Day. For months, Allied commanders had prepared for this moment. The beaches of Normandy were no longer names on a map. They were objectives, coded in chalk across briefing boards. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. Each one would be written in blood before the day was done. But first, the skies had to be cleared. That job belonged to the Thunderbolt. From English airfields in Dorset and Sussex, pilots took off into the dim light before dawn. Many were barely 20 years old. They had rehearsed this moment 100 times, yet now as they rose through the fog, every breath felt heavier. In the cockpit, one pilot whispered to himself, "Let them make it off those boats. That's all that matters." Below, the channel glittered with landing craft, row after row of gray steel and courage, and over them flew the P-47s like angels of thunder. The first task was destruction. Bridges, fortifications, bunkers, gun emplacements, anything that could slow the Allied landings had to be erased. Thunderbolts dove from the clouds, releasing bombs that carved fire into the cliffs. Each pass left black scars on the French coast. German anti-aircraft guns lit up the sky, orange flashes cutting through fog, but the P-47s pressed on, again and again. They flew low enough to see the waves shatter against the beach obstacles, low enough to feel the heat of explosions rising from below, low enough to smell the sea mixed with smoke. Inside the German bunkers, chaos reigned. Telephone lines were cut, radios jammed. Commanders screamed orders into static. One officer, Oberleutnant Franz Kruger, later wrote, "We thought the sky itself had turned against us. There was no up or down, only noise and dust and death." The flying barrel, once mocked for its bulk, was now feared as the herald of invasion. By midday, the beaches were alive with thousands of soldiers pushing inland. Whenever resistance stiffened, the call went out, "Get the Thunderbolts!" Within minutes, they came, screaming down in pairs, unleashing rockets into German strongpoints, clearing the path for advancing infantry. One infantryman from the 29th Division recalled, "When those jugs came in, you could feel the ground shake. We'd lift our helmets and cheer even as the bombs fell, because it meant we were going to live another hour." But for the pilots, D-Day was not one mission. It was endless. They flew 7, sometimes 8 sorties a day, refuel, rearm, take off again. The airfields of southern England became revolving doors of thunder. By nightfall, their faces were gray with smoke and salt. Their hands shook from adrenaline. Yet, when the order came again, "Target Caen, target Falaise," they climbed back into the cockpit without a word, because they knew if the bridges didn't fall, if the trains still ran, if the German tanks reached the beach, the invasion would die before it began. In France, retreating German convoys stretched across the countryside. Each time they moved, they risked drawing the attention of the U-boats. Soldiers learned to travel at night, engines off by day, hiding under trees and bridges. Every time we heard that deep roar, one Wehrmacht driver recalled, we froze. Sometimes they passed. Sometimes they didn't. You never knew if your road would still exist in 5 minutes. The Thunderbolt became more than a plane. It was a symbol of inevitability. Every bridge destroyed, every convoy burned, every rail line shattered. All of it tightened the noose around Hitler's Western Empire. By July 1944, Allied armies were breaking through at St. Lo. Tanks rolled where trains once ran. And above them, the thunderbolts still circled, watchful, patient, merciless. The flying barrel, once mocked, now ruled the skies over France. That summer, as the sun set over Normandy, pilots gathered by their planes, too exhausted to speak. They had witnessed the turning of the tide, and felt it in their bones. The beaches were theirs, but the war was far from over. They looked east, toward Paris, toward Germany, and knew that the storm they carried in their wings was only just beginning. For now, though, the sky above Normandy was free. January 1945. The war was burning itself out, but no one in Europe could yet feel peace. The skies were iron, the rivers frozen, and the cities below little more than ash. Above it all, the thunderbolts still flew. From Belgium to the Rhine, from the Ardennes to Berlin, the P-47s hunted the remnants of the Reich, convoys, trains, tanks, anything that still moved beneath the gray winter clouds. They were tired machines flown by exhausted men. But even now, when the end was near, they pressed on. For the pilots of the 9th Air Force, the winter of '45 was a season of both triumph and sorrow. They had watched Europe burn for 2 years. They had seen comrades vanish in smoke. And now, as Allied forces pushed east, they carried the terrible duty of finishing what had begun in Normandy. Their missions had changed. No longer escorts, but executioners of the German war machine itself. Rail yards, fuel depots, columns of retreating armor. Anything that could fight tomorrow was destroyed today. A pilot from the 405th Fighter Group later said, "We didn't count kills anymore. We counted the number of times we came home." In the towns of Western Germany, civilians learned to fear the deep rumble of the radial engine. To them, the P-47 was the sound of the sky collapsing. Farmers covered their wagons with branches. Mothers pulled children into cellars. Every movement brought risk. "We lived in shadows," remembered one woman from Koblenz. "Every time the engines came, we prayed it was not our turn." Yet even among German soldiers, there was a grudging respect. They called it der Donnerschlag, the thunderclap, a machine that could take punishment no Messerschmitt could survive. Inside the cockpits, the tone had changed. There was no joy left in victory, only necessity. Each mission was a mechanical rhythm. Takeoff, dive, fire, climb, return. One pilot described the sound of bullets striking his armor plate as rain on a coffin. He flew 22 missions that month. He stopped speaking about them afterward. By now, even the mechanics were showing strain. Engines were patched with scavenged parts, wings riddled with old scars. But the P-47 endured, stubborn as the men who flew it. In March 1945, the Allies reached the Rhine. The river that had guarded Germany for 1,000 years now lay exposed under Allied firepower. And above it, the thunderbolts. They struck at every bridge, every ferry, every crossing. The roar of their Pratt & Whitney engines became the soundtrack of Germany's final collapse. But even as victory drew near, the cost grew unbearable. Missions over the Ruhr Valley met flak so dense it turned daylight to smoke. Planes vanished without trace, swallowed by clouds of fire. When the pilots returned, their voices were hoarse, their laughter forced. Each empty bunk told a story that would never be finished. Below in the ruins, life clung stubbornly to what remained. In shattered towns, old men shoveled snow from rail lines that no longer connected anywhere. Children searched the rubble for bread crusts and bits of aluminum. To them, the war was not nations or strategy. It was the sky falling again and again. And still the engines came. war is never only about courage or invention. It is also about what we choose to destroy. The Thunderbolt's legacy was power, pure, relentless, industrial power. In 10 months, it obliterated 86,000 targets. It crippled the Reich's arteries and paved the way for peace through fire. But peace built on ruins carries its own silence. When the guns finally stopped, the pilots walked among the wreckage of Europe. Some looked at their planes and wondered if they had created salvation or devastation. They had fought for freedom and seen it measured in ashes. A lieutenant wrote home, "I think we did what we had to, but sometimes when the engines stop, I hear nothing, and that nothing feels louder than the war." In May 1945, the Third Reich surrendered. The Thunderbolt had done its work. It would soon be replaced by newer machines, sleeker, faster, born from the same forge of necessity. Yet for those who flew it, the P-47 would always remain more than a machine. It was a fortress of air and willpower, a symbol of what men can build and what such machines can do when the world loses its balance. Some of those pilots lived to see the jet age. Some never came home at all. But all of them carried the same truth. The sky remembers. The Germans called it the flying barrel. To the Allies, it was the Jug, a brute of iron and thunder. But history knows it by another name, the aircraft that broke the Luftwaffe. It destroyed 86,000 targets in 10 months. And in doing so, it ended an empire. Yet, when the smoke cleared and the engines fell silent, only one question remained. What do we lose when we win a war like that? Autumn 1945. Europe is gray again. The fires are out, the guns are cold, and the world smells of wet earth and burnt metal. The war that consumed 6 years of human life has finally ended. But for those who built it, who flew it, who survived beneath its skies, peace is not silence. It's a haunting. For the men of the Thunderbolt squadrons, the noise has stopped, but the echoes remain. Engines still hum in dreams, smoke still rises in memory, and the faces of the fallen linger in every reflection. When the pilots returned home, they were greeted with cheers, flags, and brass bands. They smiled for photographs and waved from trains. But behind every grin was a quiet vacancy, a weight that no one back home could truly understand. They had seen the power of the modern world unleashed. They had watched whole cities vanish from altitude, and they had learned what it meant to wield that kind of power day after day, until even victory felt like a burden. One pilot later wrote in his diary, "People keep telling us we won. But some nights I still hear the engines, and I wonder if we ever stopped fighting." Back in Farmingdale, Long Island, where the Republic aviation plant had once thundered with life, the assembly lines fell quiet. The workers who had built thousands of Thunderbolts now returned to ordinary lives. Teachers, mechanics, farmers. They had forged wings that changed history. But they too began to question what those wings had truly achieved. In a small workshop office, a senior engineer named Alexander Kartveli, the man who designed the Thunderbolt, sat at his desk surrounded by drawings. He stared at the outline of a new concept, sleeker, faster, powered by a jet. The world had moved on, but his eyes lingered on the old design, the heavy radial engine that had carried so many men through hell and back. He said only one sentence to a journalist years later, "We built the perfect war machine. I only wish we had built it for peace." In Germany, the reckoning was harsher. Cities were rubble. Factories lay silent, filled with twisted iron and ghosts of what once was industry. Children played among the ruins of their fathers' machines. For Luftwaffe veterans, the memories were equally heavy. They had once ruled the skies, proud, invincible, until the tide turned. Now, as prisoners or civilians, they remembered the roar of the Thunderbolt's guns and the helplessness that came with it. One German pilot wrote in 1946, "We fought with skill, but they fought with endurance." The Thunderbolt was not elegant. It was inevitable. Even in defeat, there was a strange respect, a soldier's understanding that courage exists on both sides of destruction. History books would later call it the machine that broke the Luftwaffe. But the truth was more complicated. The Thunderbolt broke more than an air force. It broke the illusion that war could ever again be fought cleanly or heroically. It was the warplane of industry, a symbol of a new kind of conflict where power came not from knights in the air, but from the factories, the engineers, the unending tide of production. Steel had replaced strategy. Numbers had replaced names, and yet every number still hid a heartbeat. Years later, a veteran named Harold Red Montgomery was asked what he remembered most about his time in the Thunderbolt. He paused for a long time before answering. It wasn't the flying. It was the faces. The kid who didn't come back. The mechanic who waved you off in the morning and wasn't there at night. You start to wonder, how much of you stayed up there? That question would haunt an entire generation. The war had ended, but the world it created was just beginning. From the wreckage of the P-47 came the jet age, the F-84 Thunderjet, the F-105 Thunderchief, faster, louder, deadlier. The engineers who once built the flying barrel now built weapons that could cross continents and carry atomic fire. In trying to end one war, humanity had learned how to start 1,000 more. In the East, former German engineers were captured or recruited by the victors. They were told to rebuild, not with vengeance, but with vision. Some helped design the early jet fighters of the Cold War, alongside their former enemies. The world's battlefields had shifted, no longer over Europe's fields, but into the skies of technology, ideology, and fear. And somewhere in all that progress, the echo of the Thunderbolt remained, the memory of an age when men first learned how easily the sky could be turned into a weapon. By 1947, most Thunderbolts were decommissioned or sold abroad. Some found new life in foreign air forces. Others sat forgotten in hangars, their metal skins fading with time. Yet every so often, when one of them flew at an air show, the old pilots would turn their heads and listen. They'd hear that deep, familiar rumble, the same sound that once shook the heavens, and for a moment they were young again. The war never truly ended for them. It just learned to live inside the quiet. History had recorded their victories, but only they remembered the cost. The Thunderbolt's legacy was not just power, it was proof that courage and consequence are always born together, and that when men build machines for war, they must also learn how to live with what those machines remember. 70 years later, a quiet airfield in upstate New York, a silver P-47 Thunderbolt rests beneath the open sky, polished metal gleaming in the morning sun. Its propeller turns slowly, reluctantly, like an old soldier waking from a long sleep. Children press against the fence, covering their ears as the engine starts. The sound is deep, raw, alive. And for a few moments, time folds back on itself. The old men watching from the benches don't speak. They simply listen, because that sound, that thunder, once meant everything. The Republic P-47, Thunderbolt, became one of the most respected aircraft of the Second World War. It was the workhorse of the European skies, a machine built not for elegance, but for endurance. Its 850 caliber guns, its heavy frame, its unbreakable heart, all symbols of an age when courage was measured in steel. In the 10 months between Normandy and the fall of the Reich, it destroyed 86,000 targets. But its true story isn't only in the numbers. It's in the men who flew it and the men who faced it. It's in what they built, what they lost, and what they left behind. In museums across the United States, the Thunderbolt stands as a monument of power. Visitors walk around it slowly, reading the plaques, tracing their fingers over its smooth aluminum skin. Most see only a machine, but to those who know, it is something else. It is the echo of every dawn takeoff over muddy airfields in England. It is the ghost of every pilot who whispered a prayer before rolling down the runway. It is the sound of freedom bought with exhaustion, ingenuity, and sacrifice. In Farmingdale, where the Republic factory once roared, a single hangar remains preserved. On its walls hang photographs, young men in leather jackets, eyes squinting against the wind. Many never returned, but their faces, frozen in black and white, seem to ask one question: did we do enough? Across the ocean, in the war museums of Germany, the story is told differently. There, the Thunderbolt is remembered not as an icon of victory, but as a symbol of devastation. It represents the overwhelming tide that no courage could hold back. Yet even there, among the relics of defeat, some visitors linger a little longer before its image. They too see more than a weapon. They see proof of how far human invention can go and how easily it can be lost to the madness of war. One historian in Munich wrote, "The Thunderbolt reminds us that war is not only about who wins, but about who survives to tell the story." In the decades that followed, the Thunderbolt spirit lived on in other machines, the jets that guarded Europe during the Cold War, the strike fighters that carried its lineage into the jet age, but none ever carried quite the same weight or the same sound. That deep growling roar, it belonged to another time, a time when flight still felt human, when men and machines shared the same breath. At every air show, when the P-47 takes off, veterans stand quietly and remove their hats. Some smile, some cry. And as the plane climbs into the blue, you can almost see the past rising with it. All those lost missions, all those silent skies. The sound fades. But for those who remember, it never truly disappears. Because the Thunderbolt was never just an airplane. It was a promise that even in the darkest hours of war, men could still build something strong enough to bring them home. Today, only a handful of Thunderbolts remain airworthy. Each one is a living memory carried by careful hands and reverent hearts. They fly not for victory, but for remembrance. Every flight is a salute to those who built, flew, and fell beneath the iron sky. To the engineers who worked by lamplight, to the pilots who vanished over France, to the civilians who looked up and prayed it would pass them by. In their stories, the past becomes present again. In their silence, history breathes. The Thunderbolt story is not one of triumph alone. It is a story of endurance, of industry, of humanity caught between progress and destruction. Its wings carried both courage and consequence. Its legacy lives in every generation that asks not how we fought, but why. Because war in the end is not erased. It lingers in the clouds, in the photographs, in the sound of an engine starting after 70 years of silence. And as long as that sound still echoes, so does the lesson it left behind. War doesn't vanish. It changes its shape and waits to be rediscovered.